So let's get going. Hi, everyone, and welcome to our August 2021 Albany Pine Bush Science Lecture. I'm Richard Naylor from the Friends of the Pine Bush community who co-sponsor with Commission staff our monthly science lectures. Before we start today's program, Shifting Paradigms, wanted to mention a couple housekeeping notes and talk about a couple upcoming programs. First, as questions occur to you, we encourage you to use the Q&A at the bottom. Just type in your question and Dylan will direct your questions to our speaker, probably at the end. Just add them whenever you think of them. So we're working on a new series of science lectures and we'll post it on the website as well. And we put it in our newsletters when things are finalized. Right now, some things are up in the air. And we do have some upcoming programs, though, Friends-initiated programs. We're going to have a mixer at Wolf Hollow. We don't know yet if it's the 18th or the 25th of September. We're going to have Tyler Briggs show and tell about a prescribed burn at Gettysburg National Battlefield on October 12th or the 13th. And we have another one that we have 2 days on also. But you can get started on this one. Our third book club Zoom discussion will be on Fox and I by Catherine Raven. Fox and I has gotten super good reviews, so I'm certainly going to give it a go. I noticed it's even being translated into German. I was going to order that, but it's not out yet, so I canceled that one, and we'll do that in English. So with that, on to Dylan to introduce today's program.
Thank you so much, Richard. I did not know you spoke German.
Yeah, das kann ich.
So it is my pleasure tonight to welcome our speaker, and thank you to all of our participants for joining us tonight. Our speaker this evening is the Albany Pine Bush Preserve Commission's Conservation Director, Neil Gifford. So Neil started out his academic career at Paul Smith's College, where he earned an associate's degree in ecology and environmental technology. He then went to Plattsburgh State University, where he got his bachelor's in environmental science and ecology, and then finally went on to receive his master's degree. And for that, he studied the breeding season bird ecology of fire-dependent jack pine sandstone pavement barrens of Clinton County. So he has been with the Albany Pine Bush Preserve Commission for 24 and a half years. So going on a quarter of a century with the Albany Pine Bush Preserve Commission. And since he's been here, he's been a volunteer, he's been a seasonal conservation technician, he's worked seasonally for the prescribed fires, and worked his way up from preserve ecologist to conservation director, which is the position he holds today. So thank you so much, Neil, for conducting our lecture tonight, and I'm really looking forward to it.
Great, thank you, Dylan. And Dylan, if I end up with any of those typical microphone issues, just let me know and I'll try and fix it. All right. Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Dylan. Thank you, Richard, for the science lecture series and for the invitation to present tonight. This is a presentation that if you're one of our volunteers, you may have already gotten a sneak peek at, but it's a presentation I put together for a fire ecology conference earlier in the spring. And seemed like it would be a nice addition to the lecture series. So thank you, Dylan, for including me in this year's series. So yeah, we're going to talk tonight about shifting paradigms, ecosystem restoration, and the fact that ecosystem restoration is very different than ecosystem maintenance when it comes to figuring out how to manage very degraded pitch pine scrub oak barrens. Attempting to restore ecosystem dynamics and endangered wildlife habitat in highly degraded fire-dependent ecosystems by simply applying what we think we know of post-colonial disturbance regimes can be logistically challenging and ecologically ineffective. So in this presentation, we'll examine solutions to the many logistical challenges associated with successfully using fire in a fragmented urban landscape and highlight important differences that we've learned between what we need to do in the restoration phase of things and the maintenance phase of things, especially as it relates to fire. We've been managing the preserve for 30 years, and 30 years of managing the world's best remaining inland pitch pine scrub oak barrens has taught us a lot. So in this presentation, we'll provide an overview of how that learning has refined our understanding of ecosystem dynamics, but also the site's management needs. We've learned a lot in 30 years, so I hope to kind of give you a preview of that this evening. My co-authors in this talk are our fire manager, Tyler Briggs, the Commission's conservation biologist, Dr. Stephen Campbell, and field ecologist and entomologist, Amanda Dillon. So in this presentation, we'll discuss how do we know what the site should be when we have no reference community to guide our work. And I'm going to use that term reference community a few times, and not everyone may be familiar with what that means. For some ecosystems in North America and around the world, there are still fully functional, highly pristine examples that you can use and quantify to inform management decisions in similar systems that are highly degraded. We don't have that luxury in pine barrens. There is no reference community. There is no pine barrens, in particular, no inland pitch pine scrub oak barrens that are large, fully intact, fully functional, supporting healthy populations of all the plants and animals that are requisite to a pitch pine scrub oak barrens. So given that we don't have a reference community, how do we know what the site should be, let alone how to manage it? I'll set the context for the site and its significance. We'll talk a little bit about how adaptive management and how monitoring our work has facilitated a pretty significant paradigm shift in understanding what makes this place tick and how to manage it. And we'll finish with a brief consideration of some additional questions. So as many of you probably already know, the Albany pine bush is a northeastern interior pine barrens located in east central New York State. It's one of fewer than 20 pine barrens that exist today as an archipelago of rare fire-dependent habitat islands in a virtual sea of closed canopy forest and human development. The fact that these barrens share many rare plant and animal species suggests much greater connectivity between them in the past. But without a functional reference community, how do we know what we want to restore, or let alone how to get there? So if you look at this map here of the northeastern states, hopefully you can see the outlines of the states with New York, Vermont, New Hampshire, Maine, Massachusetts, Connecticut, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania. And there are some dark islands that I've labeled on that map, and that's kind of the archipelago of pitch pine scrub oak barrens that are left. And we kind of separate the coastal pine barrens like New Jersey, Long Island, and Cape Cod from the inland versions like the pine bush and the Montague plains. So because we have no reference community, understanding the desired future condition of the system and how to get there requires in part understanding the site's history. So just how old are the barrens in Albany? Pollen, charcoal, and carbon-14 dating of sediment cores from a pine barrens vernal pond at the heart of the preserve reveals that a pine oak dominated system has persisted here for roughly 6,600 years. So in this slide, the two photographs on the right are cores from the pine barrens sediment cores from the pine barrens vernal pond, which is just shy of a meter deep. So the muck goes down about a meter, and then you hit a hard pan of clay. And that meter represents a total of, from today, or 0 years before present, to the bottom, when you hit that clay hard pan, 6,600 years before present is how old. So all of that history is encapsulated in a meter of accumulated organic matter in the pine barrens vernal pond. This is work that was put together by Kurt Stager and one of his students from Paul Smith's college. Those same cores reveal a recurring fire history just as long. And our academic partners are currently working on rebuilding this fire history. So if you look at this core, You'll notice that a lot of dark bands. All of those dark bands, we believe, represent charcoal layers in the core, which correspond to fires. Some of the charcoal bands are very thick and dark, representing larger, more catastrophic fires. And there are lots of very light dark bands, which we believe represent more frequent, less intense fires. And what Paul Smits and Dr. Steger are currently working on is evaluating the carbon-14 dating associated with each of those charcoal layers and reconstructing the fire history, at least the fire history in and immediately adjacent to that Pine Barrens vernal pond. But the site's been burning for 6,600 years, best we can tell. And that fire history contained in the cores appears pretty consistent with the historical fire frequency of North America. Using fire scar data, fire scars on trees from across North America, we understand that frequent fire was the norm historically, not the exception. And I'll talk more about this in a minute, but if I don't, remind me. But the idea that when the European colonists initially got here, they experienced this Thoreau-like idea of, thick closed canopy forests across New England and across North America, or at least Eastern North America. It's really it's very much a myth, and it's a myth related to, in particular, the time scale that colonists looked at, not when they first got here, but a couple hundred years later, after we had altered the fire regimes and indigenous populations pretty significantly. But getting back to this slide, so not only did they burn, but most parts of North America burned frequently, including the Hudson and Champlain valleys, which are illustrated on the blow up of this map on the right. That yellow and around Albany actually gets orangish in the higher resolution image. So yellow to orange colors, suggesting a fire frequency of 10 to 15 years here in Albany and throughout the Hudson Valley. And this history is a really good lead on the fire regime needed to maintain Pine Barrens. But how did those fires start? Anybody? I'm not going to bring up this map again, so if anybody has any questions about that map, now would be the time. The colors here, this is kind of a heat map. The darkest red represents a very frequent fire frequency of around every 2 to 4 years. The orange is looking at around 5 to 6 years. The yellow is looking at 10 to 15 years. The greens are a fire frequency of around 20 years. So you can see much of North America pre-colonially was dominated by very frequent fire. Well, how did those fires start? While lightning certainly played an important occasional role, less so in the East, research by Guyette and others suggests that even relatively small, isolated populations of First Nations people would be more than sufficient to initiate frequent fire. And one of the things, I'm not going to get at this again, and this reminds me of it, but the book 1491 and this book that I illustrated here, Forgotten Fires, really looks at the newest anthropology from North America suggests that native populations here pre-colonially were much, much larger than previously thought. There were actually more people in Central and North America than there were in Europe, in all of Europe, in the 1400s. Not only through accidental ignitions, but it appears that intentional indigenous fire was common, not only in the Albany area, but across North America. Keep in mind, too, that prior to suppression, any fire would have burned until it either ran out of fuel or was extinguished by the weather. Finally, consider that this fire paradigm was the probable reality for thousands of years. Sorry. For thousands of years between deglaciation and European occupation in North America. Across North America, indigenous fire was used extensively to hunt. And they hunted, this book, 1491, if you haven't yet had a chance to read it, by Charles Mann, it is an amazing deep dive into the anthropology of North North America and Central America prior to European colonialism, both by the Spanish in Central America and by the English in North America. But these Native Americans were using fire to hunt everything in the desert Southwest and Southern California, grasshoppers and rabbits. They were using fire to hunt bison, bear, and deer throughout the East. Native Americans were extensively using fire to improve and expand forage. There are the firsthand accounts that have been that are in the 1491 and in that previous book, Forgotten Fires, talk a lot about firsthand accounts of indigenous people using fire to hunt bison in Western New York, in Virginia, in West Virginia, in Pennsylvania. And what the anthropologists have been able to piece together is that not only did Native Americans use fire, but they intentionally used fire to expand the grasslands. If you think about it, Native Americans did not really domesticate a lot of animals the way folks did in Europe, Africa, the Middle East, Asia. In North America, they spent thousands of years domesticating the landscape because that then provided them with all of those wild meats that they love to eat. They also use fire extensively for berry to increase and improve berry production, to ease travel and hunting. There are plenty of accounts throughout in the book about people driving carriages throughout the eastern forest when they first got here. John Smith galloping through woodlands for miles because the forest was that open. It was more of a savanna and a grassland than it was a closed canopy forest the way we think of New England forests today. But they also used fire a lot to reduce hazards. Think about it. If you live as First Nation people, if you're living in a landscape that was prone to fire, and you're using fire to cook and for other reasons, the landscape was very prone to fire. So there's lots of evidence to show that Native Americans were burning frequently to actually reduce hazardous fuels and reduce the chances of catastrophic fire. Many of the things we're now getting back to in the world of prescribed fire in North America and around the world. They also use fire to both suppress woody growth, and there are some really great accounts of Native Americans burning actually to burn off woody shrubs and stimulate straight, smooth shoots of several species of shrubs that they could use in their basket weaving. So we're actually burning to manipulate the vegetation so they would have straight, smooth, new shoots to use for weaving baskets. Both of those books are really, really fascinating. The Indigenous Peoples' History of the United States is also a phenomenal book. From my perspective anyway, it was a very unique perspective on the history of the United States when the entire history is told from the perspective of indigenous people that lived here. So keep in mind too the timescales. Indigenous people used fire for thousands of years before European colonizers arrived. Non-indigenous dominance, so European dominance in North America, is really only about 400 to 500 years old. So Columbus 1492, but really it wasn't until almost 100 years later that we had the first colony was established. Fort Orange was established in 1624. Plymouth was 1620. So it's really only been about 400 years that we've been dominating and managing the North American landscape. Native fire was still common in the West at the beginning of the 20th century, and the Native American population was around 100 million in 1492. Currently, the U.S. population is 331 million. If you think about it, in 1491, according to Charles Mann and his exhaustive review of the archaeological and anthropological record, in 1491, more people lived in the Americas, in Central and North America, than lived in Europe. And one of the things that the anthropology has figured out more recently is that the initial contact from Europe, even though we weren't setting up colonies and permanent establishments in the 1400s and 1500s. Those initial contacts, unbeknownst to the people coming from Europe, were infecting North American native people with a variety of diseases, not the least of which was smallpox. And that by the time Europeans were really here, almost 150, 200 years after Columbus, establishing permanent settlements, a vast majority, and the estimates vary from 50 to 80% of the North American native population had been decimated by smallpox. And again, don't take my word for it. The anthropology and archaeology in those books is completely fascinating. But the other thing I want to point out with this slide, if you think because the hardest concept for me was trying to get the putting a time frame into how long indigenous people were using fire on the landscape. And I came at this almost backwards because I was really trying to figure out the ultimate question for us, which is, what does the maintenance fire regime of this community look like? So what did the system look like? And how frequently did it burn? And what did those fires look like when populations of carners and whippoorwills and smooth green snakes and hognose snakes and all the things that depend on barrens, their populations were high. We know historically that the preserve, pine bush, covered at least 25 to 50,000 acres. So what was the fire regime? What did it look like? And what's the fire regime needed to maintain it? Because that kind of helps give us a sense of what our target needs to be. So when you think about this, the glacier receded. So the timeline here goes from today, which is 0, to 10,000 years ago. And I use 10,000 because as a rough estimate of, right after the glacier receded. And so 10,000 years ago is also the oldest indigenous artifacts in New York, which were found on a beach on Lake George. So that's kind of the oldest that we know of indigenous people living in New York or being in New York. We know from those sediment cores that the preserve has been here, or the pine, not the preserve, the pine bush, the pitch pine scrub oak barrens have pretty much been here for about 6,600 years. So we're talking, the order of magnitude of indigenous fire running the show across most of North America is on the scale of thousands of years. To put that in context, we've been managing the preserve for about 30 years, since 1991. Right, and it's been 400 years since Fort Orange, the predecessor of the city of Albany, was founded. So you think about what we've done to the system and to the landscape and to the ecology of this place over the last, just a couple hundred years is really what we as managers of the preserve are trying to reverse to get back to a steady state, healthy, viable pine barrens that more resembles what would have been here in all likelihood for several thousand years prior to European colonization. That's kind of how I got into these questions a little bit, is thinking about what is the preserve, what is the pine bush, what should it be, and how do we get it back to that condition. So in thinking about all of that and the historical fire, the modern fire record is surprisingly similar, even though the system at this point was pretty heavily degraded. Modern fire records reveal that abundant fire in Albany, with an average of 2 to 15 fires per year between 1929 and 1986. And we split these up between small and large fires being more than 100 acres. And they occurred throughout the year. So I apologize, I should have changed those numbers to months, but that is a calendar on the bottom, running from January to December. And the blue bars there are small fires of less than 100 acres, and the orange bars are larger than 100. And what you can see is there's a distribution there across that time scale, with most of the fires happening between March, April, and May, which is basically the dormant season before things green up. But also that there were fires occurring almost every month of the year outside of December. So based on this history, and this history was put together prior to the Nature Conservancy initiating a fire management program here in 1991. Managers initially hoped that fire alone would be the heal-all for restoring ecosystem function and rare species habitat in the pine bush. However, there was limited information on fire effects or the fire regime needed for maximum benefit to the many rare species of interest. So in addition to historical fire records, we also have historical wildlife information. And those accounts, and indeed the simultaneous long-term persistence of so many habitat specialists, like the ones you pictured here on the slide, indicate historically robust populations of many species that are rare and or declining today. The composition of this species-rich wildlife community is therefore itself another good indication of ideal past habitat conditions, conditions that were in large part the result of the historical fire regime. Unfortunately, 19th and 20th century suppression and human development meant that the composition, the structure, and the function of the pine bush and those other pine barrens I showed you previously were seriously degraded. We can get a small taste of that change in this 1950, which 1990 time lapse. So this is a black and white aerial image of the pine bush area in 1950. And if you look at this, there's a couple of things I want to point out before I transition to 1990. One, right away, there are a number of recent burns on this map that jump out in a varying age. Like here's looks like a relatively fresh one when this image was taken. But if you look, and hopefully this is coming through in the image that's coming through on the internet, but you can see a fainter black all across this big section of the pitch pines of the pine barrens. So it's indicating an older fire, either earlier that spring or the previous fall. Here's another relatively fresh fire. So fire was common in the landscape still in 1950. You'll notice it's one relatively large, contiguous piece of open space, largely pine barrens. At the tip of my, hopefully, I don't know if you can see my cursor or not, but I hope you can. There's the Pine Barrens Vernal Pond in Coney Barrens East is right there, that black oval. And there are the railroad tracks running along near the northern edge of running along the right-hand side of the slide. At the lower right-hand side of the slide, Rensselaer Lake shows up pretty clearly, and in particular the peninsula between the two forks of Rensselaer Lake. So as this slide transitions to 1990, keep your eyes on the lake. Do that one more time. So again, 1950 to 1990. And now you can see the lake. Then you've got the interchange with 87 and 90. You've got the New York State Thruway running through the middle of the pine bush, Washington Avenue extension through the middle of the pine bush, and a whole lot of development. And this development reduced at least 10,000 contiguous hectares, or 25,000 acres of pine barrens, to fewer than 6,000 very fragmented acres, and resulted in major shifts in plant and animal community composition and structure. So several animals went extinct, like black rat snakes, black racers. Eastern box turtles are largely extinct in the preserve. We don't think they're here anymore. There's just a couple of examples. And by the 1980s, remnant barrens here supported tall, dense thickets of extremely volatile fuels and severely depleted, unstable relic populations of barrens-dependent wildlife, like the Carter blue and the eastern whippoorwill. As you all know, as a result of these changes in 1988, the New York State Legislature and the governor created the Albany Pine Bush Preserve and the Commission by law. And the commission was created to grow and manage the preserve. To date, 3,350 acres have been protected. And that's the darkest green shading on the map. And we have goals to protect an additional roughly nearly 1,000 acres. And that's that bright green color on the map. Illustrates the areas we want to add to the preserve. So as you can see from this map, the preserve is not done yet. And at that time, the preserve was really more of a thicket. Much of the remnant barrens looked like these pictures when the preserve was initiated. It was still considered one of the best remaining global examples of an inland pitch pine scrub oak barrens. And it's also the type locality, or the first place the corner blue butterfly was ever identified. But the preserve also supported tiny remnant populations of many other animals considered at risk by the New York Natural Heritage Program, Nature Serve, state and federal wildlife agencies, and NGOs like the Nature Conservancy. So to give you a sense here, I just want to point out, there were almost no true barrens in the preserve when we started managing it. It was really a thicket of scrub oak, huckleberry and blueberry beneath an open canopy of pitch pine and oak. And in particular, you can see, if you look at that upper right-hand picture of the group of people, That was one of our seasonals. It's Ellis, Dr. Ellis Margolis. Ellis is a PhD fire ecologist out west now. But Ellis is 6 feet tall. So again, a dog hair thicket of scrub oak is really what the preserve was. It was more of a pitch pine scrub oak thicket than a pitch pine scrub oak barrens. And in 1991, 30 years ago this spring in April, controlled burning or prescribed burn program was initiated in the pine bush. And these initial fires were exclusively in the spring dormant season from March through May. And all of these pictures here are dormant season prescribed fires in the preserve. But these fires could be logistically challenging, like this 1994 prescribed fire in Blueberry Hill. As you can see, after decades of fire suppression, dormant barrens can produce extremely high flame lengths, rapid rates of spread, lots of smoke, and lots of stress for fire managers. These burns also produce limited ecological effects. They maintain the scrub oak thickets, but they did not significantly reduce the litter and duff or expose the mineral soil sufficient to trigger regeneration of important plants like pitch pine, the native prairie grasses, or wildflowers like wild blue lupin. Lupin is the only food plant for the endangered carnival butterfly as a caterpillar. So we realized that the system was so heavily out of balance that we could not rely on fire alone to safely and effectively achieve our ecological and fuel reduction objectives. And this resulted in a major paradigm shift that relies heavily on mechanical and chemical pretreatments to eliminate invasive species and reduce and rearrange hazardous fuels. Much like our own health, the actions required to reset the system after serious decline are quite different from the actions needed to maintain a system that is functioning well. A restoration regime is not a maintenance regime. And this was a really big realization for us. The idea that fire alone wasn't going to do what we wanted to do. The system was too degraded for too long to simply let fire, reintroduce fire and have it solve all of our problems. Increase the areas of grasses and forbs, wildflowers, trigger pitch pine and lupin regeneration, rebuild the carnival butterfly population to something that was healthy, and eliminate invasive species, let alone reduce hazardous fuel loads in a pretty urban environment. So as many of you probably know, we initiated silvicultural treatments to get rid of, to thin native forests and get rid of non-native invasive black locust. A lot of mowing as pretreatments for fire. Unfortunately, a good deal of chemical herbicide work to not only eliminate invasive plants, but also reduce that scrub oak thicket and create enough open space to support lupin and native grasses needed to carry the carnival butterfly population. Applying these treatments, the mechanical, chemical, and fire tools, and applying them in the right sequence has resulted in logistically manageable fires. And in particular, combined mechanical pretreatments with growing season fire resulted in reduced flame lengths and rates of spread. And you can see that in that center picture. All of these pictures are from the same burn. So we call this management unit friendly because it is sandwiched between the New York State Thruway, Route 155, and in the background there you can see that hill of open grass is the Albany landfill. So we named it friendly. These are all this is all from the friendly fire of August 2019. In that middle picture, that's Dylan standing there with those flame lengths to give you a sense of scale. Dylan is like what, 5'10"? These growing season fire resulted in reduced flame lengths and rates of spread, greater fire effectiveness with less intensity. So we ended up with really ecologically meaningful fire, better smoke management, and reduced risk. And compare that center picture with Dylan of a growing season mow and burn treatment to that earlier dormant season fire image I showed. Same fuel types, different time of year, mechanical treatment in the growing season with Dylan, dormant season prescribed fire in Blueberry Hill in that dormant season fire. So dramatically different fire behavior. And what really rocked our world was the realization that these less intense fires, like next to Dylan, actually had greater ecological benefit in meeting our goals. And if you want, I could talk more about that in the Q&A, in the question and answer at the end. But these combined treatments have also allowed us to expand the burn window from just those 3 months of April, May, and June, or March, April, and May, to 11 months a year, increasing the opportunity to apply fire and the annual area burned. And the graph here illustrates the annual area burned between 1991 when we started and it looks like we went to 2019 with this graph. And in particular, you can also see the blue sections of those stacked bars are the growing season fires that we initiated in 2003, and the red bars is the dormant season contribution. So we're still burning in the dormant season, and dormant season fire is great at helping us maintain the habitat once it's restored. Growing season fires are great at helping us actually restore ecosystem health to degraded barrens. And this has helped us recreate the kind of diverse fire-managed landscape that better mimics how fire likely operated in this landscape historically. And the colors in this map here is kind of a quilt or a kaleidoscope, but this quilt illustrates the colors. Each of the colors is a different burn year. So you can see we have a nice mosaic on the landscape of multiple burn years over time. And to date, we've burned over 1,100 total hectares, or it's about 2,600 acres of the preserve. We believe this better mimics the historical anthropologic indigenous fire regime that maintained the system for thousands of years. But it's not enough to just make management units black. We have to know if we're achieving ecological objectives for the system and for the rare wildlife that it supports. And that's where monitoring comes in. Monitoring, in this case, comparing mowing to combined mowing and growing season fire, shows us we are simultaneously improving the structural diversity, and that's the graphs, the two graphs on the left, upper and lower, while maintaining plant species composition. And we know that here real quickly, that upper left vegetation structure. So the blue triangles are the mow and burn treatment, the gray circles are the mow only treatment. And when we compare all the things that we measured, you see that they separate out. So there's a pretty decent difference here between the triangles and the circles, telling us the treatments created different outcomes, significantly different outcomes when it comes to vegetation structure. And the things we measured in particular in the lower graph here, lots of bare ground in the mow and burn area, no bare ground. You'll notice there's no green bar there because there was no bare ground in the mow only. Conversely, there was lots of litter and duff. In particular, duff is decomposed leaf litter that it's basically organic matter. Lots of duff in the mow only and no bare ground. And likewise, we ended up with sedge and grass cover. We improved the structural differences between those two sites, and that's really what you're seeing in those two pictures. This is also in the Truax Barrens. We took an 8-acre management unit, mowed the whole thing, and then burned only half of it, and then compared the result. But we did maintain the plant species composition. So if you look at this lower right-hand graphic, you can see the triangles and circles are pretty well mixed, suggesting that from a species composition perspective, they're very similar, which is what we wanted. We wanted to maintain this plant species, but we wanted to dramatically alter the structure with these treatments. So we showed that it worked. And this has enabled lupin seeding and the expansion and lupin seeding and expansion and pitch pine recruitment, neither of which were evident following many years of dormant season fire alone. And in that upper picture here, you can see the lupin, and all of that lupin was seeded following growing season mowing and burning. There was no lupin in this management unit prior to being able to get out there and do the mowing and burning treatment to prepare the site for seeding the lupin. And in the bottom slide, hopefully you can see those little pitch pines we would never see, and we're still analyzing the data we've collected following the number of these treatments, but we never saw this kind of pitch pine recruitment following dormant season prescribed fire. And just to help you illustrate how many 4 to 6 foot tall pitch pine seedlings there are in that slide, each of the arrows is pointing to individual pitch pine saplings. And that's a direct result of growing season mowing and burning in high quality pine barrens. That's a phenomenal result. To understand if this new paradigm is improving ecosystem dynamics, we also monitor the distribution, abundance, productivity, and survival of rare and indicator wildlife. So these species effectively serve as, canaries in a coal mine or surrogates, system-specific surrogates for ecosystem health. If the ecosystem is functioning well, the distribution and abundance of the rare animals that really depend on this habitat, their distribution should be improving. They should be found in more spots in the preserve as we manage, and their abundance should be going up. And lo and behold, that's what's happening. And one of the best examples of that from the data we have is the Kerner blue butterfly. The blue bars here illustrate the area we survey each year, the area we sample, and the double dotted line. So this line connecting the dots between the red and blue, the line connecting the red and blue dots. You can see in 2013, that marks the population level. And in 2013, the population exceeded the federal recovery threshold of 3,000. And we've been above 3,000 every year since 2013. And in particular here, the red dots illustrate the first brood of butterflies that result from eggs that overwinter. And the blue dots represent the second brood of butterflies that's out in late July. That come from the eggs laid by the adult butterflies in that first brood. But not only have we seen the population go up, we've also seen the distribution of the butterflies go up. And that's what these pie charts are showing us. You can see early on, pretty much all of our eggs were in one basket. But over time, we have added the different colors in these pie graphs represent the different sites that we monitor, different subpopulations. What we want to be seeing is that the number of colors in those pie charts is improving over time, showing us that the distribution of the butterfly across the preserve is improving. Of note, the 2020 population size estimate, despite, because of COVID, we had to survey fewer sites. But we actually saw a pretty dramatic population increase in 2020. And the population went from around 8,000 in the second brood of 2019 to over 46,000 in the summer brood of 2020. And keep in mind that 40,000 number is only for the area we physically survey, which is only about 13% of the occupied Kerner habitat in the preserve. But it's not just about one species. We sample a variety of species, and the story repeats itself. We know, for example, the preserve supports large populations of many of these groups. For example, thanks to Dylan's work, we know we're now at over 180, that's 180 species of bees and wasps in the preserve, 53 species of ants, and pretty robust populations of pine barrens moths. In particular, a couple of species like this one, the wax sallow moth, was rediscovered after having thought to have been extinct in the preserve for over 20 years. Same story holds true for birds. The bird point count data, along with breeding season bird banding data, also show improved distribution and abundance of pine barrens birds, excuse me, including many that are declining regionally and nationally, like the eastern whippoorwill, brown thrasher, the towhee, the field sparrow, the kingbird, and the prairie warbler. Here we show male density estimates for the 6 best pine barrens indicator birds. And on a particular note, the whippoorwill seems to have returned to the pine bush after 30 years of being absent. And best we can tell, started breeding here in 2018 or 2019. Our first confirmed evidence of breeding was in 2019, when we happened to capture a female with a brood patch, indicating that she was either sitting on eggs or nestlings. Sorry, I hit the button. And in portions of the preserve, we have transitioned to a maintenance fire regime now of relatively frequent, low intensity, moderate severity fire with some surprising results. For example, these maintenance growing season fires and maintenance growing season fires, but in particular, the maintenance growing season fires burn around the densest patches of lupin, as you can see here, providing refugia for Kerners, a species that cannot survive fire in any life stage. These refugia would not exist in the dormant season. Surprisingly, lupin that did burn resprouts, flowers, and stays green until killing frost. while unburned plants die back in midsummer. This extends the potential time that caterpillars have to survive. Lab experiments also show that carner larvae fed lupin from plants that resprouted following fire produce more eggs. So growing season fire can produce a diverse mosaic of both lupin quality and quantity, which can help stabilize and improve the function of the carner population overall. So after 30 years of management and monitoring, we realized that healthy inland pitch pine scrub oak barrens were not represented by the thickets we inherited. Rather, in its best form, it looks like this: much more of a savanna, an open canopied grassy shrubland that can simultaneously support large populations of the rarest wildlife. A landscape that can also be maintained with relatively frequent, low intensity, moderate severity fire. A landscape that likely resembles the one maintained through indigenous fire for thousands of years. But while we think we've figured out how to safely and effectively use fire to meet our goals, many questions remain. Questions not only about how to refine the desired results today, but also about the future function of the site in the face of an uncertain climate future. Ecological fire management is really fire effects management. What we're interested in are the effects of fire, not so much the fire itself. Fire effects vary with season. How will climate change influence our ability to burn when we need to burn to get the desired effect? Will restoring a system capable of supporting a high frequency, low severity fire regime improve our ability to apply fire despite climate change? Only time will tell. Long-term management and monitoring will help us answer these questions. And our funding, the commission is funded through the New York State Environmental Protection Fund, and that funds most of our research and management. But also when it comes to fire, we owe a great deal of thanks to the USDA Forest Service for their wildfire risk reduction grants, and the Northeastern Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies, who are currently helping fund a pretty big effort helping us look at the effects of these growing season fires on declining pollinators in the Northeast. So I think that is it. That's what I have for you all this evening. If anyone has questions, Dylan, I would be happy to try and do my best to answer them. Thanks
Awesome.
again for the opportunity.
Thanks very much, Neil. That was a really comprehensive talk. We do have a couple questions. Karen asks, are you, which I assume means the commission, talking to the Mohican and Haudenosaunee people whose ancestral lands are in the pine bush to talk about their management practices or connections to the land?
Yes, and Aaron has really been taking up thank you, that's a great question. And yes, and Erin Keinel, our education director, has really been taking the lead on that. She's been dealing directly with representatives from the Haudenosaunee and from the Mohicans. And one of the things that she and I would like to be able to do at some point in the future, kind of beyond the typical, what's becoming more common now are land acknowledgement statements at the beginning of talks like this, and increasingly at prescribed fire conferences and workshops, I'm seeing that. But there are places, including in Western New York, where Native people come out to say a few words at the beginning of prescribed fires. Tyler was recently out at Ganongdagan, which is a New York State Park property in Western New York, where Native people from the Haudenosaunee were there to say a few words. And I hope someday that we would be able to get them more directly involved like that and helping us literally see the connections between their ancestral practices on the landscape and what we're doing today. It's pretty humbling to me anyway. Again, this is a personal comment, not really on behalf of the commission, but it's humbling to me to think that we're spending so much time and energy and resources, and we generically, to learn how to do this effectively, like what you see Tyler doing in this slide. Really to learn how to mimic what they did for thousands of years in the landscape. And what we're realizing is that part of the key of doing this effectively is really, burning frequently low intensity and low severity fire. That's how that is not only how the anthropological research strongly suggests that's how Native Americans used fire on the landscape, but it's also how increasingly the ecological evidence from fire scar data and other data like cores from peat cores like we took from the Heimer's Vernal Pond, not just here but across North America. A lot of that physical ecological evidence suggests that's actually what happened, and that Native Americans were using fire very often, and in doing so, they were actually farming prairies and forage for a whole host of herbivores and critters that they ate and made, and whose skins and everything else they used in their day-to-day lives. But yes, I certainly hope that we're able to build stronger and more obvious connections with Native people who are still here. That's a great point. The question actually, implicit in that question is the fact that Native Americans, indigenous people, are not only, a culture and a people of the past. They're still here, despite everything that they've been through and the disease and the outright attempts to eradicate them. Native people are still here, and we have an awful lot that we can learn from them.
All right. Richard asked early on, I wasn't sure, when you showed the picture of the soil cores that were taken in the wetlands.
Yep.
He said there are light bands and dark bands, and he was wondering if those dark bands were possibly Native American fires.
Yeah, that's what we think. There's no way to know that for sure. But we definitely think the various shape, the banding is a result of indigenous fire. And again, this is the book Forgotten. I don't know what you guys can see. Forgotten Fires by Omer Stewart. This has a great introduction, and the editors of this are an anthropologist and an ecologist. He did amazing work putting together firsthand accounts of Native people using fire. So we have really great evidence to suggest that Native people were using fire frequently in the landscape, and we think that's what's happening with the fire in these cores. But that's where I was going with that. But one of the things that the ecology of historical fire, even out west, I mean, the fire you're seeing today out west is the combined effect of fire suppression for over 100 years, excuse me, and climate change. So you had dangerous fuel accumulating for over 100 years, and now climate change increasing the probability of ignition. But what he was able to show is that even out west, where lightning-caused fires are much more common than they are in the east, right? In the east, lightning, it almost always comes with rain. So getting lightning, it happens. It's happened in my tenure here in the preserve, but lightning doesn't necessarily start lots of fires in the east, with some exceptions. But out west, lightning is a much more common instigator of wildland fire. But looking even at the wildland fire records, based on cores, based on fire scars of really old trees across very large geographies, the ecologists have figured out that the historical fire frequency out west far exceeds anything that would have been on the landscape due to fire exclusively, fire alone, or lightning alone. So even out west, and that's where they really drew the conclusions and connected the dots between the fact that Native Americans were using fire to fight fire. They were using fire to reduce the likelihood of catastrophic fire coming through and sweeping over their settlements, their villages, their communities. And the fire frequency out west, the fire frequency here is much more than this landscape would have been able to have support with lightning alone. So it does kind of also flip on its head. We have this glorified notion of indigenous people, and I think they did live with the land and live in the land, but it's not that they didn't have an impact on the land. It's not that they didn't have, it's not frequently, in a lot of the accounts that I've read, typically of European historians, right? Native Americans are depicted as being light on the land and more or less being like an animal in the forest, not being like we are, like humans in the forest, having an impact on that land and on those populations, but they very much did. And they actually, through the use of wildland fire, over the course of thousands of years actually changed the trajectory, and the evidence in the books spells this out pretty clearly. Changed and modified the trajectory of a huge portion of the North American landscape, and the plant and animal communities that are here are very different than they would have been absent thousands of years of indigenous fire. It's when you dig into the details and the evidence that's in these three books, the Forgotten Fires, 1491, and the Indigenous History of the United States, the commonalities and the exhaustive research that is annotated in these books is really just mind-blowing to me. It's talk about a paradigm shift. It dramatically shifted my thinking about the historical North American landscape and the really involved and intentional role that Native Americans had in shaping it. So hopefully we'll get at that someday, Richard. But yeah, understanding this fire history, we won't be able to tie individual black line, individual records to individual indigenous fires, because that kind of information is not available. But we certainly hope with carbon dating to illustrate how frequently fires happened, at least in Conner Barrens East around the Runnel Pond.
Okay,
See what
I
happens
have.
with an open-ended question? I end up going off on a whole bunch of detail. Sorry about that.
I got a couple more questions about fire, and they kind of lead into each other. So one is, what have we learned about prescribed fire over the last 30 years that we've been doing that? And kind of following that, how often do you need to burn an area to maintain the ecosystem?
Great question. So one of the things we've learned is the biggest thing we've learned is that fire alone wasn't going to do it. That we had to go in, literally had to, if we wanted to meet our goals of restoring pitch pine scrub oak barrens to the point where they could support big, robust populations of Conner blues and prairie warblers and inland barrens buck moths and all the other things that depend on pine barrens. We absolutely had to go in with these mechanical pretreatments, the mowing, the silvicultural treatment, the tree cutting. Seems very counterintuitive. And many of us resisted the tree cutting beyond what was clearly non-native invasive black locust. But even the closed canopy stands of pitch pine, white pine, and oak are artificial. They're the result of fire suppression. We have to go in if we're going to turn those sites back into barrens and thin the forest. If we want to turn, there are many places in the preserve, even as recently as the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, where we know we had really big populations of lupin and Conner blues that in the 80s and 90s were doghair thicket closed canopy scrub oak. We tried everything to eliminate and reduce the dominance of scrub oak so that we could get lupin and the grasses and wildflowers back out in the barrens, like what you see in Conner Barrens East and the Truax barrens. And none of it worked. That initial 2003 treatment, the data I showed you with that side-by-side picture of the mow only and the mow and burn, we were hoping that those fires would be intense enough to be able to actually kill some of the scrub oak and more permanently create space for lupin. And it did for 2 growing seasons, and by year 3, it was the scrub oak was right back to a doghair thicket again, which meant we melted. We had a researcher here. We melted his thermocouples, so all he could tell us was that glass melts at 800 degrees C, and that's how hot that fire was, and it still wasn't enough to really knock back the scrub oak in any meaningful way. So we actually ended up going through and using some herbicide in scrub oak thickets to reduce the canopy cover of scrub oak and generate the open space we needed for lupin. So the biggest thing we've learned is that we have to do those pre-treatments, as counterintuitive as they seem to be, that you would go into a nature preserve and mow and cut trees down and use herbicides if we want to reach our goals. And the commission's goals are mandated by law, so we don't really have a lot of wiggle room in deciding we're going to try and do something else. So we ended up with utilizing those tools, and then following that up with fire. The other big thing we've learned is really how logistically feasible those growing season fires are after a mowing treatment. That is the single biggest thing we've learned, that you could have, flame lengths that are only 4 to 5 feet tall, but because you're burning in the growing season when everything is green and the fire moves so slowly, that one treatment will eat up inches of organic matter that accumulated from decades and decades of fire suppression was mind-blowing. And we've ended up exposing mineral soil. And once we did that, we started getting pitch pine regeneration. We started getting lupin expansion. So that's the biggest thing we've learned. The second part of your question, how frequently do we need to burn a site? We're still trying to figure that out, which again, that's really the rabbit hole that led me to the deep dive into the indigenous fire history, not just of Albany, but of North America, and trying to understand at some point all these barrens were largely connected. At some point there was something systematic that facilitated their ability to support all of these plants and animals in robust populations that allowed them to persist for a long time. All the other Conner sites are in the upper Midwest. We're near the northern edge of pitch pine's range. Pitch pine is much farther south. And those two stories are repeated over and over again with a whole bunch of plants and animals. So the fact that all those pine barrens had to have been historically connected, and that there was a system maintaining that connection, so that wildlife, what we consider rare wildlife populations today, must have been much more common. Conner blues in particular. Conner blues live 3 to 7 days at most in the wild. The typical adult Conner blue doesn't travel more than a couple hundred meters in its entire short life. So how the heck are they spread all the way from Minnesota to New Hampshire? In order for them, that landscape of lupin and open savanna, and the Conners are really a savanna animal. They're not a prairie animal. They need that open canopy. I'd say savanna, the savanna structure, right? Open canopy to overstory, open canopy scrub oak layer with lots of grasses and wildflowers. That gestalt had to have persisted across that entire area long enough for Conners to colonize all of it, when the typical adult doesn't travel more than 200 meters. A dispersing animal, a small percentage of the population, does disperse up to a kilometer. But even if they were traveling a kilometer a year, you're still talking about a long time for an animal like that to occupy a space from Minnesota to nearly to New Hampshire. So we think the fire frequency that's needed to maintain that is somewhere on the order of 3 to 5 years. And we say that because a lot of information is known about, in particular, grasslands and oak savanna, and how frequently those sites need to be burned to maintain them as such. And that's partly the reason why it didn't take very long at all for most of what was once oak savanna and pine barrens and much more open canopied forest structure across at least the mid-Atlantic states and southern New England to the upper Midwest. Because it needs to burn so frequently, it didn't take long. And over the course of a couple hundred years, the landscape changed very quickly. But we're still trying to figure that out. Just how frequently do we need to burn any given spot to maintain it in high quality habitat? And today, of course, we can't just go with that number. We need to actually try it, because now we have very limited space, very limited populations of some rare species. So we're looking at things like, maintaining lupin, of course, in Conner habitat, not burning too frequently. But also there are a whole bunch of physiological things about the plants. Like scrub oak doesn't start producing acorns, I don't think, until 3 to 5 years after fire. So if you want to maintain those open scrub oak barrens now, those grassy shrublands or shrubby grasslands, we want to maintain them like that, it means we have to somehow suppress scrub oak recruitment. We have to suppress pitch pine recruitment, or we're going to end up right back to those scrub oak thickets. So we have to burn frequently enough that we're not stimulating massive acorn crops, or burning enough that when we do get acorn crops, we're not getting a massive influx of new scrub oak seedlings or sprouts from the roots. And that's just one example. So one of the things we're working on, where I think the focus of the Commission's management research will be moving forward, is trying to look at what are all of those ecological metrics and systematic metrics that we can use as indicators of the ideal fire frequency. So it's not necessarily that any one number is going to work, but we really need to think about how frequently can we burn any given site in the preserve while maintaining it in a high quality habitat without eliminating any given plant or animal species. So we have general rules of thumb right now. Right? We don't burn more than a third of any given section of the preserve in a given year, and we try not to burn adjacent thirds in consecutive years. And that's especially true where we have endangered species. But that's an ongoing question. We've got a really good indication that it's about 3 to 5 years, but we'll let the research tell us exactly how we need to be managing fire in the maintenance phase of things moving forward. Again, another dissertation style answer to a very simple question.
Well, they have complicated answers.
Indeed, they do.
All right, let's get away from fire for a bit here. Dylan says, towards the beginning of the presentation, there was a map of the current preserve and intended expansions in the future. Is there a timeline in place for those expansions?
Yes, as people are willing to sell it to us, and as we have the money to buy it. Where'd that map go? There it is. Yes, so the commission only works with willing sellers, or for donations of land. So we have limited resources. We frequently rely on the Nature Conservancy and the state of New York, and increasingly the Friends of the Pine Bush to help us with land protection efforts. But yeah, it's really, as properties come on the market and as we have the resources to protect them, we try and do it. The hardest part in this landscape, we're in Albany. We're sandwiched between Albany and Schenectady. Property is expensive. And as a government entity, the Nature Conservancy as a nonprofit, we're really obligated. We can't pay really more than fair market value for property. A private developer, right, a big box store, or any commercial or major subdivision, or a real estate developer can, if they want to, pay a lot more than fair market value to secure a piece of property they want. So in that regard, we're at a bit of a disadvantage when it comes to competing for land when it does come up for sale. But it's been working relatively well. We've protected 3,350 acres, and a lot of that is increasingly thanks to the work of our municipal commission members and working with developers to ensure that significant portions of important properties are set aside and donated to either the municipality or the commission to be added to the preserve. And we've protected an awful lot of land in all 3 municipalities that way, in Guilderland, Colony, and in the city of Albany, by working with the municipal planning agencies and property owners to add land to the preserve through set-asides and donations. So there really is the timeline is whenever we can do it. There were a lot of naysayers when this project first started in the early 90s that we would never protect the minimum was 2,000 fire manageable acres. And today we're at 3,300 acres and growing. So it's never say never. I'm confident we'll get there. In particular,
Right.
with the help of the friends and donations to the Friends. So if you're interested in helping add land to the preserve, becoming a member of the Friends is a great way to help do that.
All right. Richard also asks, do we have any tools to help us adjust the effect of climate change on plants to provide insects with the food sources they need?
Yes and no, Richard. So it's not so much that we can, well, I shouldn't say that. We have figured out that we can actually modify the physiology of plants. Like we always thought that lupin, for example, mature lupin plants die back in early to mid-July. That's just the way it is. That's what all the literature says. And once we started hitting lupin in the early growing season with fire, lo and behold, when that lupin resprouts, it stays green until killing frost. First year lupin seedlings stay green until killing frost. There's lupin in sections of the preserve that we planted in April that have really nice looking, well, this rain this year, have really nice looking plants right now. I was out at a site 2 days ago. The lupin plants that grew from seed this year are still big, green, and vibrant. I found one stalk that actually was flowering. So that's a result of fire. So by managing sites with fire, we can modify the physiology of plants a little bit. When they resprout, we improve the availability and the forage quality for insects in particular that are grazing or browsing on them. One of the really cool physiological things that happens with plants after fire is that because the plant is resprouting pretty quickly and resprouting the whole plant, not just things like lupin, but also woody plants like scrub oak. When it puts on all that new growth all at once, it's incredibly nutritious. So it's more nutritious because fire is effectively fertilizer. But also the defense chemicals against insect herbivory are typically at their lowest right after a fire and all that fresh sprouting growth. And one of the things we've realized, like inland Barrens buck moth feeds exclusively on scrub oak. It's more nutritious, probably tastes better because it has fewer defense chemicals. And we know that females prefer to oviposit on those long, smooth, fresh distances between the leaves on the shoots that come back after fire. So there are some things we can do with fire to manipulate plants and their ability to support some of the rare insects. But one of the biggest saving graces, I think, of the pine bush compared to all the other pine barrens is the dune field. We have a heterogeneity, a diversity of topography in the pine bush that most other pine barrens, none of them really have. The massive field of parabolic sand dunes that the pine bush sits on. We've got high and dry right at the tops of dunes. We've got low and a little cooler and more moist at the bottoms of dunes. We've got north-facing slopes that have less direct sunlight, so they're a little bit cooler, a little bit more humid than the exposed south-facing slopes. Then you've got varying densities of canopy across all of that. So we're actually thinking that one of the things we can start doing to try and build climate refugia for insects like carners is to try and get more lupin on the cooler, more humid, north-facing slopes of dunes. And if you look today, if you walk around the preserve, and we're looking where the sun is, historically, the bulk of the lupin has been on south-facing slopes, which are hotter and drier than north-facing slopes. So we are thinking about proactively trying to utilize that dune structure to improve the ability of creating our ability at the local scale to create some climate refugia that may help keep species around a little bit longer. Great question.
All right. Now, how are you doing? You want to take a couple more? Or?
Sure. I'm here.
Right.
They're here. Why not?
We're back to fire, which I'm sure you're horribly disappointed about. Are there times when the burn doesn't go as planned? And what happens when an area doesn't burn as well as you want it to?
Good question. And an area not burning as well as we want it to is partially, the result of a burn not going as planned. Ideally, they'd all go well and burn the way we want them to. So yes, there are times when a burn doesn't go as planned, and that's on both ends of the spectrum. Sometimes they're too hot, and that dormant season fire that I showed you, that was the really big flame lengths from the early 90s. That was one that didn't go as planned. We had a wind shift, and we had planned to burn just one small management unit, and we ended up burning, I think it was 3 of them. By the time we fell back and contain that fire. So every prescription and every prescribed fire we do has multiple contingencies built into the planning. So we try and run through all of the possible scenarios, particularly what happens if things get too hot and get out of control. And then we implement those plans, and that's worked exceptionally well. But more often, to your second question, because we're trying to burn under conditions where fires won't get out of control, it means we're burning on the cooler, wetter end of what's allowable or what's permitted in our permits. So it isn't all that uncommon where we have a burn that doesn't burn as well as we want it to. A good example of that is one Tyler and the crew just tried to do over on Rapp Road a week ago. I think it was a week ago, maybe it was 2 weeks ago. But we thought we had good conditions, but we didn't give the unit enough days of drying before we attempted to burn it. So it burned real cool. And in those cases, when it doesn't burn as well as we want it to, in that case, there's still enough fuel there. We're going to try and hit that management unit again this fall. If there wasn't enough fuel, like it burned, but it really didn't burn well enough or hot enough to dig through the litter and duff and expose sand, excuse me, we might wait, instead of waiting 3 years to go back, in the restoration phase, if there's not carners that in a site that we have to worry about, there are times when we will burn it every year or every other year to keep trying to get, in the restoration phase, to get it where we want it to go. So if it doesn't burn as well as we want it to, we'll try and burn it again. And probably sooner than later. As soon as we have enough fuel and the conditions are right that would allow us to burn it safely, we'll go back and try and do it again. But also there were cases, that is one of the reasons why we end up doing some of these mowing treatments, because it generates fire behavior and fire effects in some of the scrub oak thickets that we wouldn't have if we didn't treat them by mowing them first. So, good question. Do we have a goal? I can see this one, Dylan. Do we have a goal of hectares burned every year? Good question, Dylan. So we do have a loose goal, and I don't know if everybody knows this, but the initial study, what they call the Pine Bush study, the Gibbonish study, basically established the foundation that the legislature used in creating the law to create the commission. And the idea is we'd protect at least 2,000 fire manageable acres, and that we would burn on average 200 acres a year. But that's really in the maintenance phase of things. So ideally 200 acres a year, but the reality is as the preserve grows, and that was ideally for a maintenance phase of the 2,000 acre preserve. Well, now we're at 3,300 acres. 300 to 400 acres a year would be, I think, is ideal. But really, it's less about the numbers we burn per year and ensuring that we're burning safely and that we're implementing fire. Whatever fires we do are safe and they're effective. And as you can see, let me see if I can show you that again. Look at this. There it is. If you look at this histogram of the acres or the hectares burned per year, it varies. And this is largely depending on the weather, right? So some years we did really great. In 2019, Tyler and his crew, commission staff, volunteers, DEC forest rangers, burned over 400 acres that year. Other years, right, we only burned 50 to 100 acres a year. So it varies depending on the weather and crew availability and that kind of thing. But you can almost see here the histogram. I think Tyler got the job in like 2014, 2015, and he's been doing a bang up job ever since. Really, part of that is all the pre-work that Joel and the stewardship team, previous fire managers did in prepping units and prepping sites and restoring getting through those chemical and mechanical pre-treatments to prep the preserve for fire. But also, of course, it's Tyler's skill in being ready to burn when conditions are appropriate. And being ready to burn means having the permits, having the burn plans approved, having units ready, fire breaks prepared, crew on standby, all of that. So it's a pretty daunting task, but ideally, yeah, 300 to 400 acres a year, I think is a good rule of thumb. But if we only get 100 acres burned and those 100 acres are safe and effective, I'll take it. That's a good year. We burn one of the most urbanized landscapes in all of the United States. The only site that I've heard of that compares to what we're doing here are some portions of the Chicago Wilderness Preserve, just outside of Chicago, on the edge of the city. They deal with some of these same issues, and in a pretty fragmented and urban landscape.
All right, Neil, I think that's all of our questions. I would like to clear up for the record that I am 5'6".
Okay, I was guesstimating.
I appreciate it. I wish I was 5'10". That sounds kind of fun, but yeah. So yeah, thank you everyone for joining us tonight. And thank you so much, Neil, for a wonderful lecture, really engaging and a lot of cool information.
Well, my pleasure. Thanks, Dawn. Have a good night, everyone.